Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast. Joining me this morning, back for his regular visit with me, archaeologist Paul Reed, who works with Archaeology Southwest, of course. He is joining us from his home in the Taos area. Paul, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Scott. So glad to be back on with you.
Great to have you here, of course, and there is some kind of, I guess I would almost call it breaking news this week, because you just were letting me know about this. Of course, an area near and dear to all of our hearts, I think, Chaco Canyon, is coming under scrutiny yet again with some proposals from the Trump administration, the Bureau of Land Management, about that buffer zone around Chaco, and this is something I know you and I have talked about numerous times in the past, and you've been very active, and your organization's been very active about protecting the greater Chaco area, and so it is back in the news just this week, correct?
Indeed, Scott. You know, back in June, we had talked about this a little, and there had been an initial letter sent out to tribes talking about possible consultation on revocation, or some change to the mineral withdrawal zone, what I like to think of as the Chaco Protection Zone. And indeed, just last week on Friday, a formal letter was sent out telling tribes consultation was going to begin. The Trump administration and Secretary Burgum's Interior Department and BLM Farmington want to remove basically the protection on the mineral withdrawal for this area. And they've announced a process that has an extremely tight timetable, and to my mind, pretty unrealistically tight. A 14-day public comment period that has yet to start. And as you can imagine, Scott, we vigorously oppose this action. This process to withdraw these lands around Chaco unfolded over 2 years. Then Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland announced this in November 4 years ago in 2021. We went through a lengthy process throughout 2022, halfway into 2023, and then that move was finalized in June of 2023 with overwhelming public support. Over 90% of the comments, the input that came said, yes, let's protect this special place. So yeah, we're pretty appalled, but we're fired up, and we're going to oppose this as any way that we can.
Right. Now, and again, to be clear, as we always talk about, and maybe too much so, but the park itself is not threatened, right? This is an area outside of the park boundaries, but still an important area adjacent to the park, correct?
Right, exactly. Basically pushing right up to the edge of the national park. And again, this is something that wasn't controversial at all until fairly recently. And what we're talking about here is the withdrawal that is currently in place still until this process unfolds, of over 300,000 acres of public lands, BLM surface, from oil and gas development, something that does not impact the majority of the lands within the zone, and those lands that might be owned or managed by the Navajo Nation as an entity or individual Navajo latis. So, of course, this is being put forward by Secretary Burgum and the Trump administration as the main reason why they consider this action that Deb Haaland under the Biden administration took as a bad move, because, to paraphrase, most of the people out there oppose it. That is absolutely not the case based on different polling and results that have come in, and just out talking to people in the area.
Right. Understood. Now, certainly there are some folks who maybe live in the area that are concerned about any lands, any tribal lands or other federal lands, or they may have some leases or get some revenue maybe from some leases being taken away. That's still an issue, is it not?
Well, it's a concern, but I wouldn't really call it an issue because, as with this withdrawal in place right now, no existing leases were impacted, no past leases were impacted. All of those things continue on all the lands in which they exist. What this talks about is future leasing in the area. So, it's a pretty common tactic, unfortunately, if we're trying to protect different lands for the developers, in this case, the massive oil and gas companies, to get out into the area, to send representatives, and then to talk to people and say, hey, they want to come take away your land rights. This is absolutely not the case. And, I can't really oppose that vigorously enough, Scott, and say that, as we've talked on this show, with the 3 or 4 public hearings that unfolded under
Right.
Holland's process in the past, this issue was thoroughly vetted with a whole lot of people in attendance, large comment periods, lots and lots of interaction, with federal officials making themselves available. So, the claims that are being made about how this land withdrawal, this mineral withdrawal was executed, that it was illegal, it was not done properly, there wasn't public input, those are patently false.
Good to know. Good to know. And again, I know, and you, as I said, in your organization, Archaeology Southwest, and other groups have been really involved in this issue over the years. And so, again, you know a lot about this, and this area is so a little bit confusing because it is literally the checkerboard area, right? And so we have different types of land. And so this is dealing with the federal land in and around Chaco. There's still tribal land, there's state land, there's private land. But it's important that we kind of keep in mind what we're talking about, yes?
Right, absolutely. And I think that is really a huge part of why this issue, understanding what's going on out there, is confusing to folks. We have about 19% BLM lands. I believe the state trust lands are somewhere in the 7 or 8%. There is some Navajo tribal trust lands, which is a pretty low percentage, less than 5%. There's some just, other patented fee lands that are private, not connected to any tribes or tribal entities. And then there are the allotted lands, which really are the bulk of the lands out there. And again, on those allotted lands, folks who live out there, they have free reign within the confines of how those lands are managed, with some oversight by the BIA Gallup office in terms of developing any business opportunities that they wish to develop. So, I'm a little bit vexed, honestly, to hear, the notion of this is a taking. These are federal lands we're talking about, and the tribal lands, the private tribal lands, the public tribal lands, those are going to remain intact and with the full rights for those owners to exercise, and pursue whatever economic opportunities they feel are most appropriate. And so this
Sure.
affects really just a slice of the lands, but it is a very important piece of those lands.
For sure. Very true. And as you say, some of them do abut right up to the boundary of the park, which is close. And so that's the issue that comes into play. I wanted to also share, of course, the New Mexico congressional delegation, senators and representatives have all come out united against this move, which probably comes as no surprise. We have a statement here under Martin Heinrich's press release website from his office, but I think the other members of the congressional delegation all agree with this messaging, Paul Reed, and they all stand pretty united in this.
Yes, they do, and I'm really thrilled that we have such strong protectors of our cultural places in New Mexico with our 3 Congress folks and with our 2 senators. I think that's been a huge thing in terms of what our state really wants to prioritize as the protections for special landscapes, special sites, special places. And again, doing this with a balance towards the future, our energy needs, and other concerns that folks bring into play. For us, Scott, as this has unfolded over the years, we've talked about it, a lot, talked about it with our different environmental partners, with our tribal partners, with the Pueblos of Zuni and Acoma, and other Pueblos, other nations, with the All Pueblo Council of Governors. We've always made the point with all of these entities and our partners that we are looking for a balanced approach to energy development and management, and that really is a very reasonable approach, and it's one that, the mass population, that the general public really does support that. So those are kind of the things that come closest to my mind as we talk about this.
Sure.
And I think that, we'll have a very vigorous public campaign to oppose this. The thing that concerns me most is the stated 14-day limit on public input. This is an impossibly small time period. Scott. And just for comparison, when this happened, when Deb Hall, initiated the withdrawal back in 2021, they then announced in January of 2022 a very robust 90-day period that they then extended to 120 days, so that everyone who had any level of concern on whatever side of that withdrawal issue would have the opportunity to comment. There were multiple public meetings held in Farmington and in Albuquerque in just a very robust period of time. Under this current Trump administration, these time periods are being drastically shortened. They've announced 14 days for this. This is essentially impossible for most folks to respond to. And they seem to want to really rush the tribal consultation as well. And this is something that the federal government has a significant trust obligation with all tribes to consult with them on matters of direct concern. And certainly the lands around Chaco are of central concern to, all of the New Mexico tribes.
You bet. And I was going to ask you about the tribal reaction, too, that I imagine it's going to start coming, if it hasn't already, about some of the official statements from the tribal governments, who certainly, as we have talked about, have been, very vocal in their connections to this site, to this place, and in their culture and in their ceremonies and things along that line. And so I would think, I guess, that the issue could be then settled, or you could fight this in the courts, maybe, to try to at least change that timeline.
Yeah, I think ultimately, if this action goes through, there would be legal action. I don't know, of course, of any specific plans at this point. And there is an appeals process within the Department of Interior,
right,
for appealing a specific process. The concern is that if this goes through, the administration jams it through, then we could pretty immediately see leases offered, right on Chaco's doorstep. And, as you know, Scott, this is something we've been opposing and our partners for 20 years at this point.
Right.
This is just not something that needs to happen. The other side of the issue that we have talked about on the show before and has been discussed at different points in other media is this is not a profitable zone for anyone to do oil and gas development in. Our state, of course, has benefited greatly from the bonanza, if you will, of oil and gas production down in the Permian, in the southeast corner of our state. The access to oil there and gas resources is much easier. It's much faster. The air around Chaco has been determined to be marginal. So the concern we have is, why put this amazing area right on Chaco's doorstep at risk when the mineral resources are not profitable, they're hard to get to, they take extra processing. And really, this is not an essential part of any strategy that we should be pursuing, in my opinion, and in the opinion of our tribal partners and our other partners.
Right. Got you. And I guess then some folks may say, well, then even if these parcels were put up for lease, if they're so underperforming, would it be a surprise if any oil and gas company bid on these parcels to develop them, if they're so if it's such easier to get the oil and gas out of the ground in other places? Or do you just think they would buy them up to have control eventually?
Well, and I think that's really the essence of it right there, Scott. As you know, I'm not an oil and gas professional. We have plenty of folks in the Farmington area. I would certainly be glad, as we've discussed off air a few times, to come on and have a friendly debate with folks about this. But in general, it seems that the companies are interested in grabbing these lands, holding them for whatever the future might unfold. And we certainly could see skyrocketing oil and gas prices that could potentially make these lands more attractive for that kind of development. Right now, that does not appear to be on the horizon. But again, the strategy of trying to lease, as much of the public lands in the West as possible is something that doesn't benefit 90%, whatever percentage, way high percent of the public, because the public wants to get out and enjoy recreation. They want to be able to visit historic sites. They want landscapes protected. They want watersheds protected. So, these moves towards pushing energy at the expense of everything else do not reflect the will of most of the people in the American West. And this is borne out by numerous polling.
Sure. Understood. And I guess the idea, too, with this kind of going back and forth a little bit, I mean, it's a complete 360 or 180 from the Biden administration, right, is what it seems to be, would be to try to put this buffer, put this non-development zone in legislation that would keep each individual presidential administration from putting their own spin on this sensitive area?
Right, exactly. And that's why, again, as we've discussed on the show at various points, there have been, different versions of a Chaco protection bill introduced. In 2019, we went through a process. We had a bill pass the U.S. House and then get into the Senate and unfortunately stall out before that could, reach a president's desk for a potential signature. So this is something that happened earlier this year with a bill introduced in the Senate by Senator Lujan and a companion bill introduced in the House by our 3rd District Congressional Representative Teresa Leger Fernandez. So those bills exist, in theory, in this ether of, the congressional bill zone. They're not going to be brought up under the current Republican leadership at this point. So,
sure.
But that is the angle ultimately that, a lot of us advocates definitely feel needs to be pursued so that we can permanently remove these lands from, again, a very, low-level, marginal prospect of oil and gas development. There's many more productive areas that could be focused on and are being focused on for oil and gas development. And in those areas, there are certainly cultural resource concerns, but I don't think anyone is going to look at the area around Chaco and say, this is a good zone for us to, allow the potential for marginal oil and gas production to impact, this amazing ancestral Puebloan place that so many thousands of people enjoy every year.
Right, exactly. And I still think it's important that the public realizes that there is action attempted to be taken at the congressional level to try to put a permanent protection into this, or at least put it in legislation, whatever you wanted to do with this area around the park, but it just doesn't get anywhere, and that's how Congress works, or doesn't work sometimes.
Right.
But
absolutely, and we'll keep pursuing that
sure.
with our allies and folks in D.C. who really know how to be part of that world, essentially.
Exactly. I want to go back to the tribal component of this too, Paul Reed. If you know, or in your conversations with your colleagues at the tribes and pueblos in our state, I mean, if they were and when they do speak out about this issue, whether it's for or against or what have you, would their voice have a bit more pull, I guess, with some of the other folks or with the courts, as opposed to maybe an environmental group or a group like yours instead?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, we always work in the efforts that we make to support our tribal partners and really have detailed conversations and say, what are the concerns of individual Pueblo groups, other tribal groups, what is the concern of the All Pueblo Council of Governors, at a slightly higher level, and how can we best support those efforts? And, again, the federal government has a specific trust responsibility with every Native nation across the country. So before they undertake any federal action, they're required to consult with all of the tribes and Pueblos and affiliated nations who have said, we need to be part of this process. So that gives them, in my mind, the status they need. I would appreciate it myself, and they would, many of our allies would, if their concerns were taken more seriously at different levels by different aspects, depending upon which administration is in place. But those relationships, that trust relationship, is written into the law, and it's not something that can be ignored. Now, what's not in the specific law is the amount of time, built into consultation periods, and this is something that we've seen in all of 2025, is this administration's attempt to drastically shrink the opportunities for tribes to meaningfully consult, the time periods for tribes to be involved, and then moving on to a public process, the drastic shrinking of those public comment periods, which really does not allow the public to have any role in helping to shape the way our public lands are managed. And that does not reflect the values of this country and this nation, in my opinion.
Sure. Understood. And so the next steps, I guess, are to watch this order and what happens to, I guess there might be some legislation about trying to at least extend that comment period to give people more time to respond to this or start even in the appeals process once a decision has been made? Is that kind of the short-term timeline that you are looking at going forward?
Well, what we're waiting for at this point, Scott, is a formal announcement that this process is moving forward.
I see.
We expect that to come quite soon. And then, more or less the clock starts ticking for this 14-day period. And then, we're already talking to folks saying this, if you have concerns about this, now is the time to reach out to the administration, to your congressional reps, get the word out there. And then once that process unfolds, we'll be sending comment letters, getting those. If they have public hearings, and there's really no indication right now that they're planning to do that, which is an absolute violation of the NEPA process, by the way, then we will go to those meetings and have voices heard, because that is the best opportunity. Again, I'm not optimistic that with this accelerated timeline, if that holds, that there's going to be time for that. Mm-hmm. We are, on the other hand, then going to encourage the administration, Secretary Burgum, to extend these ridiculously short time period, this 14 days, and say, let's give adequate time. We're going into the holiday season for everyone, which means people are not going to be working as much. We're also heading into a very sensitive cultural period for many of New Mexico's tribes, where they're going to be doing different things that don't necessarily relate to what the rest of the world might be doing. They're going to be doing very important things that relate to their own internal ceremonies and their culture. So to ask them to respond to something this drastic is really just completely unfair and irrational, in my opinion. So we're going to be pushing on that front and saying, let's take this process into the new year and give everyone, starting with the tribal communities most affected, and then the rest of the public, an adequate time to consider this and then have their opinions heard. That's our hope.
Right. Got it. And it sounds like, again, unfortunately, you've been here before in some capacity, I think. And in having this conversation with you this morning, Paul Reed brings up another thought about another area that was kind of targeted, I think, under the prior Trump administration. And that makes me think about Bears Ears National Monument in southeastern Utah. Is that something, too, that you think might have a bullseye on it with some potential changes, too?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that we will eventually see a move to, again, reduce Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, potentially other very important places, monuments, and landscapes in Utah and elsewhere. So I think that's coming quite soon, too. So we're, as well, getting prepared to address that and to vigorously oppose that process as well. The creation of those national monuments was vetted. It again had overwhelming tribal support of the tribes in those areas and public support. So, the actions by the administration do not reflect in any way, shape, or form the will of the people, either the tribal folks on the land, who we consider first and foremost, or, the rest of us in the general public. So this is something that I would encourage everyone listening, to get involved if you feel strongly about this and make your voices heard, because, this administration seems to want to pursue policies that will completely change the way we protect and manage public lands for generations to come. So really now is the time to get all the boots on the ground and to really fight for the areas that we care most about, and for the groups like our tribal friends and colleagues who are at the forefront of a lot of these struggles.
Right, I understand. And I guess, again, what makes Bears Ears a little bit different than Chaco Canyon is that it's not a park, but a monument, and so maybe it's easier to change the boundaries of something like Bears Ears rather than the Chaco Canyon, which we've talked about, which is protected, the park itself, correct?
Right, exactly. So monuments are not created typically by congressional action and signed into law by presidents. They're nominated and created under the Antiquities Act. So that is a different process. When the first Trump administration changed boundaries in Utah and in other places, lawsuits were filed. Those were suspended when the Biden administration in 2021 reinstated every one of those monuments. So we will be back in a legal process there, which Archaeology Southwest is involved in, legal action on Bears Ears and we likely would be again, although, no formal decision. That formal decision awaits.
Of course.
What comes out of the administration.
Right. But you can certainly read the room, I guess, and maybe kind of prepare for what may be coming. And again, that's a good advice for everyone, again, who have feelings about these really important areas in the Southwest and elsewhere. If they feel strongly about it, to pay attention to some of these things that are happening. And again, as you mentioned with Chaco, for sure, the timelines may be very short from what we're used to. And so if folks feel one way or the other, they need to be ready to voice that, or to write a letter, or do whatever needs to be done within that timeline in order to make their voices heard. Is that kind of the idea?
Exactly, Scott. And, as always, coming on your show, I appreciate the opportunity, especially when we have a situation in this case where, by the time I'm on the radio again in December, this action could have conceivably taken place completely. So this really is, for folks who care about these amazing areas and landscapes, this is the call to action. So we'll have information on our website. We'll be sending out alerts, and again, and folks can certainly reach out to me. I'm really easy to find. Paul Reed, Archaeology Southwest. Glad to talk to anyone and get information out. And again, we are vigorously opposing these very destructive and disastrous moves.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, that comes through loud and clear, Paul Reed. And I know, again, you've spent a lot of years and blood, sweat, and tears out there at Chaco Canyon and elsewhere. And so you know the stories, and you've talked to the individuals and the tribes and the pueblos who have their links to that area as well. So it's important to kind of touch base with you about this issue and all the others, and you're so gracious with your time to talk to me every month, so I do appreciate that. But this is what's going on this month. Again, this all just happened within the last couple of days, I would say, even though there's no formal move. You are anticipating this probably coming in the next few days, few weeks, I suppose?
Yeah, definitely days and not weeks. So, right, this is the future is now, as we used to say back in the 70s.
Yeah, very true. Very true. And don't trust anyone over 30. I think we said that too.
Exactly.
Okay. But these days, that doesn't count anymore, because we're now, all of us are over 30. But anyway, Paul, it's great to visit with you. Thank you for your passion and for bringing this to our attention this month. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. I much appreciate the opportunity to come on and speak with you. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. That is Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest. He is my guest right here on KSJE. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.